Hi everyone, it's Megan from Tiny Orchard Quilts, and today I wanted to do just a really fast tutorial on how to get really nice mitered corners on your binding. Now I have a quilt here that's ready to go. It's been sewn down to the front. The binding has been sewn down to the front. I use a 2.5 inch binding, but this would obviously work with any size binding you like. I trim my quilt even with the edge of the binding, but if you find that your binding is like not full, if that makes sense, like if you're wrapping it around and it's way thicker on the back than it is on the front, then you might want to try trimming your quilt like 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch outside of the binding. If you do that, this method will still work, and that will allow you, when you wrap, if you want it to be the same size, your binding will still be full. Like, it won't just be a couple layers of fabric here on the outside. Okay, so here we go. Stitch down 1/4 inch. I use my walking foot to attach my binding, and it just helps all the layers kind of go through the machine a little bit easier without getting any puckers in the binding. So what you'll need is your quilt ready to be bound. I hand stitch mine to the back. Enough Wonder clips to go around the entire perimeter of your quilt, about every 6 inches or so. A hot iron, and that's it. So move your Wonder clips out of the way. And the first step is you're going to press your quilt with the binding out, away from your quilt. And for these corners, just kind of get in there as well as you can. Okay, you're going to do that around the entire perimeter of your quilt. I'm just doing this corner, obviously, to show you, but you would go all the way around, and then you're going to flip it over. And now you're going to press and clip all the way around your quilt again. So you're going to fold your binding over however deep you want it to be. I like mine to be just a little bit beyond my stitching line. I press. And then I clip while it's still warm, so it really holds that crease. Now for the corner, for this first side, you're going to press to create this 45-degree angle here. And clip it down, not too close to the corner because you need to be able to iron this again. So once you do the whole side and you're ready to do the corner, then rotate your quilt to the next side. And now what I do is I press that corner again so it's nice and hot, and then I just fold this down to make a nice miter, and then I clip it right on the corner. Now the fabric is still hot enough that it will stay there and kind of create a crease just with the pressure of the clip, and then I move on and finish this side. And I do that for all 4 corners. Then I'll show you how to stitch that corner. Okay, here we are ready to do the corner. I've hand stitched down this side, and I'm right here about to turn the corner and start this other side of the quilt. So I'm going to remove my clip, and you can see that it wants to stay there. Like, we've pressed it in place. It's not going anywhere. So I'm going to take this last stitch to get really close to the corner. And I want to come up right at that point. Right at the point of the miter where this side of the binding folds over. And then this is where you really get to tweak it. You're going to take a stitch through one side of the binding, under the other lip, and up. And this is what is going to tie that miter together. And I take another little stitch in the same place, tighten it down, and then I take one more kind of up through one side to get me prepped kind of in the right place to start going this direction. And then I start with a couple of really small stitches, and then you're off. Now, I always hand bind my quilts, and I know that there is a lot of discussion about whether or not they hold up well as a machine-bound quilt. Now, I have two little kids who, I mean, I have to do their bed linens, laundry often because, you know, we're still learning that skill. And let me get one of the quilts I hand bound for my son. I made this quilt maybe 4 years ago, and it is my son's favorite quilt. It's the Snack Time pattern from Jaybird Quilts. And this has been through the wash, I don't even know, probably 80 to 100 times. And we're talking machine wash, hot water, high agitation, you know, the sanitize cycle, and then washed in a hot and dried in a hot dryer. And I don't have any problems with any of my hand stitches on the binding here. So if you want to hand stitch, don't be worried about how it's going to hold up, because if you take small stitches and take your time, it's going to be just fine. I also just prefer how it looks. And this is straight grain binding, and I even sewed it together with flat seams. I didn't even miter the seams. This was early quilting. Let's talk about notions for binding. This is one of my favorites. It's the little clover needle holder. It holds 10 needles, threaded needles. So I fill the whole thing up with the thread I want to use for binding, and then I don't have to stop and rethread. And I change the needles, I try to do it like in January. I mean, I bind a lot of quilts, but you're only using, you're using 10 needles at a time. So I just kind of empty it out and refill it in January every year. But it's great. It holds them really snug and secure. And I like that they can all be threaded without getting tangled. And you just pull one out and it comes out ready to sew. And to load it, when you're loading it, you put the needle in the slot, and then you just put the thread through the little slot in the side, and then you spin it around, and it winds all the thread behind this blue plate. And it has a cap. Awesome. Now, as far as needles, I use milliners to bind. They're pretty long and pretty thin, but I find them to be the easiest to get through the fabric and be able to kind of pull. They're long enough that you can pull it through from this side or push it from this side. So these are my favorite needles, milliner size 9. I think I buy them from, I think they're Sue Daily brand or whatever. I just buy them in a little tube. So that's how to get nice corners. Let me find a corner that's done. So there you go. I like having nice mitered corners, front and back, for my finished quilts. This thread here. So there you go. Ironing your quilt all the way around, you know, twice takes a little time, but it does make it a lot easier to hand stitch. You're not straining your hands to keep the binding in place while you're stitching it, and it just comes out a lot more even. You know, that binding line is nice and straight. You know, you've already put so much time into your quilt. Put just 10 more minutes into the binding and it'll really pay off with nice corners and straight lines. Oh, one last thing. I use Aurifil 50 weight to bind. You know, I have it in a million colors, so I always have kind of a matching color to the quilt. And I match my thread to the binding color rather than the backing color. Obviously, these are like basically the same, but the stitches show more on the binding than they do on the backing, so I match it to my binding. There you go. Any questions? Just leave me a message, or you can find me over on Instagram at MeganMME or on my website at tinyorchardquilts.com. Have a great day.